Good evening, everyone. My name is Kenna Felix. I am the digital educator for the National Museum of the United States Army. We're very excited tonight to be joined by Robert Sutton, who is the author of Nazis on the Potomac, the top secret intelligence operation that helped win World War II. And this is kind of a local history for us here. We are located in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and not too far from us is Fort Hunt, Virginia. It's Fort Hunt is right between Old Town Alexandria and Mount Vernon for those of you who are in the area. So we're excited to be hearing a little bit more about that tonight. But let me introduce Robert Sutton here. Robert K. Sutton recently retired as Chief Historian of the National Park Service, which saw him complete a 33-year career in the service. He has published a number of books, including Stark Mad Abolitionists, Lawrence, Kansas, and the Battle Over Slavery in the Civil War Era, which was recognized as a Kansas notable book in 2018 by the Kansas State Librarian. We are very excited to have him here tonight and to learn all about this book. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it on over to Robert. Welcome.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here. It's a great honor for me to be part of the Army Museum because this story really has a lot to do with the Army. And it was just down the road, as Kenneth said, from Fort Belvoir, where the museum is. And so I think there's a really wonderful connection. And I have really been looking forward to doing this myself. And we have a PowerPoint here that I put together on the book. And why don't we move to the first slide here, Kenna? So I thought it would be appropriate, since we're talking about the Army and an Army facility, to talk about one person that I think is really outstanding. In fact, I think he's one of the most outstanding Americans we've ever had. George Catlett Marshall, who was the chief of staff during World War II. Just before World War II, in fact, in 1941, in June of 1941, the military, the American military, realized that their intelligence gathering function was very, very limited. In fact, it was almost dysfunctional. So he and his senior staff appointed a group from the Navy to go over to Great Britain, over to the UK, and spend as much time as they needed to find out what was going on with intelligence gathering in the UK. And they came back, ironically, in December of 1941, literally right when the Americans entered World War II. They came back and brought a whole collection of recommendations, and one of them was to establish one center where high-level prisoners would be brought to interrogate and to listen in on conversations, and also to check the documents that were captured. Now, they decided that it should be run by one agency, primarily the Army. However, the Navy agreed that they could interrogate prisoners initially, but eventually they would go to an Army facility where they would go through this process. Now, of course, when World War II started, we were at war on the Pacific with the Japanese, and in the East with Germany primarily. And so they were actually decided to establish two sites. One was in California, not far from the Bay Area, called Camp Tracy. This site actually was fairly easy to establish because the woman that owned this really pretty elegant, at the time, resort, hot springs resort, was willing to lend it to the Army for a nominal fund of about $250 a year. And because her son had been killed in World War I, she felt like this was appropriate. In the East, they looked at several different sites and decided on Fort Hunt. And if you could move on to the next slide here. Well, they established three programs. One was Military Intelligence Section Y, or MISY. This was the section that would interrogate prisoners and would listen in on conversations in the rooms of prisoners with hidden microphones. Military Intelligence Section X, which we'll talk about in a bit, which actually was escape and evasion. They would develop tools for American pilots that were shot down or whose planes crashed to be able to escape, and if not, they just developed this whole system to communicate with prisoners of war. That was another section developed at Fort Hunt. And finally, Military Intelligence Research Section, or MIRS, which was at Fort Hunt, which focused primarily on translating and interpreting captured documents. Okay, next one. So the site they decided on was Fort Hunt in Virginia. Now, Fort Hunt had an interesting history well before World War II. It actually was part of George Washington's river farm. And so it had a connection with our first president. This was his river farm. He actually had documented it pretty well. He actually, the day before, not long before he died, he actually rode around to all of his plantations, and one of them was River Farm. He actually had a plan for what would happen with River Farm. He didn't live to see it, but it was part of the River Farm. And then skipping ahead in right around the turn of the century, around 1900, the government decided that the coastal defenses of the United States were woefully inadequate. Across the river, across the Potomac River, was Fort Washington, which was pretty obsolete at that time. And they decided that they needed to build a fort to upgrade Fort Washington on the Maryland side and build a new fort on the Virginia side. And they decided the place to put this fort was where Fort Hunt currently is. It was a coast artillery fort. In fact, that is what survives here today, the gun emplacements that were built as part of Fort Hunt. So it had a very interesting long history. There were a number of things happened over time. During the Depression, it became a civilian conservation corps camp, a CCC camp. In fact, one of the really prominent ones. Every time a dignitary would come from overseas, they would take them there to show them how the Civilian Conservation Corps worked. And in fact, at one point, the King and Queen of England actually came to Fort Hunt to see the Civilian Conservation Corps with Eleanor Roosevelt. So Fort Hunt was selected as the place where this camp would take place. And next slide. They would eventually bring German prisoners here, and the prisoners would come to the fort in this bus that you see. All the windows were blacked out, so they really couldn't see where they were going. Excuse me, allergies are killing me. I'm sorry about that. They'd come in a blacked out bus. They would immediately go into the quarters that had been built for them. And almost immediately, they'd start the interrogation of these prisoners. The men who primarily did the interrogations of these soldiers were an interesting group. And we actually, the Park Service, while I was in the Park Service, our rangers actually were able to track down about 65 of the men who were stationed at Fort Hunt and did oral histories with them. And most of the men who did the interrogations, who we interviewed, were German or Austrian Jews who'd escaped Hitler, mostly as children or teenagers. And some of the stories are fascinating in and of themselves, how they were able to get out of Germany and Austria. And if you can go to the next slide, one example, the slide on the left, a fellow by the name of Rudolph Pins, lived in Germany. As a young boy, he didn't really, his family were the only Jews in their community, but to him it really didn't matter because he had friends that didn't really treat him any differently than anybody else. But when Hitler came to power, he began to notice things were a little bit different and became more and more different. And what he didn't know was that his family, his mother is here with him and his brother, were looking into a possibility of sending him to the United States in a program that allowed children that were 16 years or younger to come to the United States and live either with family members or with foster families. They found out about the program, they applied for it, and he was sent from his family to Cleveland, Ohio, where he lived with a foster family. And I think the family, in fact, I know his family and many other Jewish German families thought that at some point the Germans were going to come to their senses and they were going to vote Hitler out of office and they'd be reunited. Everything would be happy again. Well, it didn't happen. In fact, when he left his family in the 1930s, it would be the last time that he would ever see his family. He kept up with them until World War II started, and then he never heard from them again. And they were lost in the camps in the Holocaust. The picture on the right is a group of children who came also from Germany. A man in Philadelphia actually arranged for a number of children to come to the United States. And this picture shows them on the boat as they were approaching New York Harbor. So that's how some of them came. Another soldier who was at Fort Hunt had an interesting story. George Weidinger lived in Austria. And one day he went to school and the teacher said, "You need to go to the principal's office." Now, I don't know about any of you, but whenever I heard that I had to go to the principal's office, it never was good. Never, ever good. It was not, in my case, it was never to get an award. It was for something I did that I was in trouble for. Well, he probably assumed the same thing. He went to the principal's office and the principal said, "George, you can no longer attend school." And he said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you're Jewish." Now, in his case, this was a double shock because his parents had converted to Christianity before he was born. They had never told him that they had been Jewish earlier. And so he was shocked twice by the fact that he could no longer go to school. And the second time because he found out that his family had been Jewish. Well, he and his family were able to immigrate to the United States. They settled in Cleveland. His father had been a very successful businessman in Austria. He'd been a representative for one of the largest paint companies, United States paint companies in Europe. When he got to Cleveland, the only job he could find was as a stockman for a building supply company, which was way, 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 way below what he had been in Europe. But George said that he probably was the happiest man in the world because he was able to have a job the United States. So these are some of the stories. One of the chapters in the book deals with how many of these people who eventually would be the main interrogators and document evaluators at Fort Hunt. Next slide. Well, they had to be trained in what they were going to do for the intelligence work that they would be doing. And the place that was set aside for the training is actually now it's called Fort Ritchie. At the time, it's called Camp Ritchie, and it was a site in the Catoctin Mountains, not far from Camp David, not far from Gettysburg, in Maryland, but very, very close, a mile or two from the Pennsylvania line. It had been a Maryland National Guard site. The Army took it over and made it into what was called the Military Intelligence Training Center. And over the headquarters building, there was a sign that said MITC. Now, of course, that meant Military Intelligence Training Center. But to all the men who were stationed there, what that really meant was the Military Institute of Total Confusion. That's what they called it. But if you went there, now I'm showing here to the left, Professor Beverly Eddy wrote a book, and it came out shortly before mine on Camp Ritchie, and it's a wonderful book, so I'd recommend that as well. But when they came to Camp Ritchie, next slide, if you happen to stumble onto Camp Ritchie, you would think you would run into a German cell, because the men were transported in German vehicles. You can see they're all dressed in German uniforms, helmets and everything. So people in the fort, there were a lot of American soldiers who were dressed up as German actors who participated in different activities around Camp Ritchie. So one of the things they would have, they had captured almost every type of German artillery and small arms. So they would know what those sounded like in comparison to Allied arms. A big difference. You don't necessarily think that, but it really was a big difference. They would march goose step around the parade ground. But one of the main training facilities here was to train American soldiers. And again, these are mostly German or Austrian Jews. And the reason that they were so important is because German was their primary language. So not only did they understand the language, but they understood a lot of the nuances of the language, of the culture, and so forth. So one of the fellows who was at Camp Ritchie, he actually went to Europe. He said one of the advantages he had when he was interrogating Germans was that he loved soccer. One of the few Americans at the time who really liked soccer, and so he could converse to them about soccer. But one of the training programs was to train them to interrogate German prisoners. Now, the fellow here in the German uniform is not German. He's actually a German American dressed in a Nazi uniform. And they tried every trick they could to trip up these interrogation trainees. They would try to frustrate them. They would do all kinds of things. And one of the stories that came out of here, I love. It's one of these trainees was trying to interrogate this German. First of all, the German wouldn't give him his name or rank, so he began being frustrated. And during the conversation, this German started talking about a goulash canon. Now, if you translate that literally from German to English, goulash is a German and a Hungarian meat stew, actually very, very good. And a canon is a cannon. So he started talking about a goulash canon, and of course the poor trainees somehow trying to think of shooting beef stew out of a cannon. Well, this actually is an idiom, a German idiom for a field kitchen. A goulash canon is a German field kitchen. Well, of course, this poor guy didn't know that, but he got more and more and more frustrated, and the more frustrated he got, the more the Germans started laying it on. And it was just a horrible experience for him, but it was something that he needed to learn. I found out recently, a friend of mine was in the German army, and he said, believe it or not, they still use that term. A field kitchen is still a goulash canon in the German language. So those were some of the things that the training took place at Camp Ritchie, and they were there for usually several months. And then the training was very, very intense. Okay, next slide. So Fort Hunt, as you saw the picture earlier, was a military fort. It was not a prison camp. And so what the Army needed to do was to build a prison camp, and they did it very, very quickly. The one on the left, the site on the left, was the first site, the first prison site that is eventually was called Enclosure A. You can see the fences. Now some of the things that the military was able to do at that time, I think, are just extraordinary. They were able to build this whole entire camp, fences, buildings, quarters for prisoners, interrogation rooms, administrative rooms, cafeteria, and so forth. They were able to build this whole thing in 6 weeks. and they had some of the things that they built the Pentagon in 18 months, and so they were able to build things just an amazing speed at the time. So enclosure A was the first prison area, and on the right they got so many prisoners they had to add a second one, enclosure B, and that's the one on the right here. So that's where they kept the prisoners. So if you can go to the next slide. Inside of enclosure A and enclosure B, there were quarters for prisoners. There usually were 3 beds. It was fairly comfortable. I mean, it was not a hotel, but I would say it was pretty comfortable. Usually there would be at least 2 prisoners in a room. Sometimes there'd be 3. But in every room, in the ceiling, there were these hidden microphones that would pick up all of their conversations. And what's fascinating is what the Germans thought about what was going on. Some of them were absolutely convinced that they were being bugged. In fact, one prisoner actually gave a speech to the microphone. He was so convinced that they were being bugged. Others thought it was impossible. It was virtually impossible for them to bug the rooms, because what would be required would be to put in these microphones, which they did, of course, and then to have an area where they could monitor their conversations, because there were obviously more than one room that they had to monitor. Then they would have to find a way to record what was said, and then they'd have to do transcripts. Well, some thought it was so incredibly labor intensive and complicated that there's no way that they could be bugged. And generally, some of the prisoners acted like it was bugged. They didn't say a whole lot, and others just were so convinced it wasn't bugged they would say a lot of things. So, for example, some of the prisoners would come back to the room after they'd gone through the interrogation, the physical interrogation. Then they'd say, I told them that I was a junior pilot. I really was a flight instructor, and I didn't want them to know that. Well, that kind of created a problem for the interrogators, because now they knew that. But if they said, "How? Now we know that you're a flight instructor. We want to hear more about that," then he would know that the room was bugged. So they had to be very careful how they dealt with things like that. So it's a kind of an interesting conundrum, knowing what they were saying and knowing whether or not, and the people in the rooms knowing whether or not they were bugged. So next slide. So this is what happened. On the right side, you can see the speakers here are the what's coming out of the rooms, and they could use speakers or they could use headphones. There'd be a man at the typewriter, and on the left-hand side was the recording device. Now, it looks like a record player. Well, it essentially was like a record player. They would record conversation on discs that actually looked like records. They didn't have tape recorders at the time, and so they would record conversations, and then they did not record every word that came from these rooms, but if something sounded interesting, they would record it, and then they would type up what they found here on these typewriters in another room. To give you a sense of how much came out of here, in the National Archives, there are 102,000 pages of transcripts that they recorded from these rooms. So that was an important part of the conversation. They also, another part that was really important was the actual interrogations. In fact, Rudy Penns, the fellow I showed you earlier, of all the people we interviewed, he probably was at Fort Hunt longer than anybody that we interviewed. And so what his view of what happened there was actually very important. We actually were really, really delighted to be able to talk to him and get his perspective. So he said that a high percentage of the time that they spent was listening in on conversations, which of course were important. And a small amount of the time was spent on interrogations, but he said most of the valuable information they got were from interrogations. And so what would they do? Well, they usually would start the interrogation on a fairly small level. So they'd say, who are you? Where are you from, if you're on a ship. Early on, a lot of the prisoners were from U-boats. They'd say, "What was your U-boat? What did you think of your captain?" and so forth. And then they get a little bit more intense and ask a little bit more stuff. And they eventually try to get to learn more about the German war operation. And sometimes they would be very forthcoming, sometimes not. But they had a way of dealing with recalcitrant Nazis. And there were a few of them. There were some that were just absolutely dedicated Nazis who were just determined not to say anything. The first thing that they would do, one thing that was very important that came out of all of the interviews that we did, they said that they never, ever, ever tortured any prisoners, never used any physical torture on any of them, but they had ways of getting information. So the first thing, they'd take them down to the gun emplacements and lock them in some of the powder magazines that were from there. They'd leave them in for a day, they'd come back. Sometimes it'd soften them up and it'd work okay. But the best thing they had to get information, next slide, was they had two soldiers who were Russian Americans who were dressed in Red Army uniforms. And they'd say, "Okay, you don't want to tell us anything. How about if Ivan here takes you to the Soviet Union? Maybe they would like to hear what you have to say." And that worked remarkably well. In fact, one of the people that I interviewed said that he thought about 80% of the soldiers of the Germans, once they tried this technique, would actually start giving them information. At one point, though, the information was went a little bit too far, and a German soldier by the name of Georg Zeilinger actually attempted suicide. And the reason was because the Americans, wanted information from him. He wouldn't give it to them. He was a dedicated Nazi. He didn't want to tell them what was going on. And then he was terrified that if he went to the Russians, they would somehow get the information out of him. So he decided the only option he had was to commit suicide. Well, he slit his wrist. Fortunately, the Americans were able to intervene in time. They were able to save him, and he actually was okay. He survived, and they sent him off to a prison camp. And no longer tried to interview him. But this was one of the ways they had of getting information, and it actually worked remarkably well. Okay, next. Now, later, after the war, Fort Hunt stayed open after the war, and they began to bring in a lot of German and Japanese prisoners who were very high value generals and diplomats. And the purpose, of course, was that the Americans could see that following World War II, things were looking very much like there was going to be a Cold War with the Russians. And so one of the people that they brought to Fort Hunt was General Oshima, who had been the ambassador from Japan to Germany. Now, what's interesting, the Americans had early on broken the Japanese code, and every message he would send from Germany to Japan would be intercepted. In fact, the Americans, in some ways, would be able to intercept and translate the message before it got to Japan. So he provided a great service to the Americans. Of course, he didn't know that. But when they brought him to Fort Hunt, there was a funny story. One of the people I talked to, who was at Fort Hunt at the time, Peter Weiss, told me that the American generals were interrogating Oshima, and they thought they could get some information out of him with alcohol. And what they didn't know is that he was probably an alcoholic and drank a prodigious amount of alcohol every day. So they had a lot of alcohol, and they kept saying, "Do you want another drink? And do you want another drink?" And every time he'd drink one, they would drink one. And eventually, all the Americans were drunk. Oshima was like, it didn't even bother him. And so the people who were listening in finally had to stop this whole thing because they were afraid the Americans would give them too much information. Well, he was one of the high value prisoners that came there after World War II. Okay, next. Okay, another very important part of this whole thing was MIRS, or Military Intelligence Research Section. And the fellow here on the right, his name was Paul Fairbrook. He has become a very good friend. He's almost like my adopted father. He just turned 100, as sharp as can be, absolutely amazing. He actually gave an artist for the Park Service, he actually described what the MIRS offices were like. And so that he was able to actually draw this picture. And he said it's absolutely remarkably accurate. So Paul Fairbrook is a fellow on the left with someone over his shoulder. The fellow over his shoulder was an English teacher, professor, who actually helped them write their reports. So what they would do is they would translate and interpret captured German documents. So every day there'd be a huge bag of documents that were brought in. You can see this here in the foreground of this painting. Eventually, there were 5,000 bags that were brought in, and over 105 tons of documents. Paul Fairbrook said he thought that every time the Germans sneezed, they would document it. And essentially that was true. So what they would do is each person would have a specialty. So one would specialize, and Paul Fairbrook specialized in the high command of the German Wehrmacht. Someone else would look at the Gestapo, the SS. Another one would look at the German youth programs and so forth and so on. So each one had a specialty, and the documents would go to them. And he said they were so excited that they would just jump on these things and start translating them immediately. Now, the person who was the overall officer in charge of this program, the man standing there, you can see he's a captain standing near the doorway without a hat. His name was John Kluge. Now, he was German. He was born in Germany, came to the United States. He eventually was very, very successful in business. In fact, in the mid-'80s, he was considered the richest man in the United States for selling a company that he'd started called Metro Media. But at this time, he managed this MIRS program. And so many of they not only would interpret things, but they would publish different reports that were very important. So if you can go to the next slide. The most important thing they did was called the Red Book. Why was it called the Red Book? Because it had a red cover. The Order of Battle of the German Army. And what this did, there were actually 3 different iterations of the Red Book. It would describe every single German division, who the commander of the division was, who the chief of staff was, where it had been located, where it was at the time, what its specialty was. And so, for example, for D-Day, this was almost like a Bible for D-Day, because they knew exactly the German forces that were in the area. It was an incredibly valuable thing. And this was probably the most important thing one of the most important things that came out of Fort Hunt was the Red Book, or the Order of Battle of the German Army. They also produce other things. So the one on the right is a sort of a glossary of German scientific terms. That was another thing. But Paul Fairbrook, on one day, he was going through one of the things that he did was to go through the org chart for the German hierarchy. And one day he saw a new box for a morale officer, and he mentioned it to his commander, to John Kluge, and he said, well, why don't you track it down and find out what this is? What he found out was that after the assassination attempt on Hitler, Hitler became very paranoid. He was probably paranoid anyway, but he became even more paranoid, and he created this new position for a morale officer in the senior staff, but also each division was required to have a morale officer, and every officer was required to swear allegiance to Hitler. What Paul Fairbrook determined from his study was that by the end of the war, Hitler probably was more concerned about loyalty to him than he was about actually fighting the war. Very, very important thing. So this was another very important part of the operation at Fort Hunt. Okay, next. Okay, the third section was very unrelated. In fact, all the people who worked in these different sections, they had no clue what each other was doing. Each one was so secret, they had no clue what each side was doing. But it was called MIS, or Military Intelligence Section -X. And what they would do is they would develop kits for American pilots. The one on the left is called a barter kit. There were two, one for the East, for Europe, and you can see a lot of gold coins, gold rings, a lot of gold stuff, because that's what they thought they wanted. They were sealed in these wax containers, and the one for the Pacific had other things. They liked watches and other sorts of jewelry. And so the hope here was that if a large plane was shot down, if they found civilians, they hopefully could use these to barter, to be protected and maybe get food and so forth. And so this was part of the operation of the escape. Well, also each pilot on every plane would have an escape kit. So if he was shot down, or if the plane crashed for whatever reason, he hopefully would be able to escape. And what was in this kit was tablets to purify water, a surgical saw if they needed it, fishing equipment, maps, and so forth. So hopefully they would be able to escape. One of my mother's first cousin actually was shot down in Germany, and he talked about this escape kit. Unfortunately, when his plane was shot down, his flight suit was ripped away, and so was his escape package. But he was very badly injured, and it didn't really matter. So this was an important part for pilots. But if they were captured and sent to prison camps, the Luft camps, the camps for pilots, were much nicer than other prison camps. And they had a little bit more lax security. So what the Americans would do, was they developed a cryptographic communication system that would communicate with these camps. So the fellow who was in charge of this, name was Silvio Bedini. He actually later on became a very well-known and very famous curator at the Smithsonian. But during World War II, he developed this cryptography program, and he would communicate. What he would do is he would get soldiers who were not very educated to write the letters. And he said the reason was because if you had people who were not educated writing letters, the Germans wouldn't be suspicious of people like high-level, highly educated people who wrote sentences, long sentences and three-syllable words and so forth, to communicate with these camps. And one of the communications was to say, there's a package coming from a bogus place, and you need to be on the lookout for it. And when it comes, make sure the Germans don't confiscate it. Make sure you somehow get in touch with this. And what would be in these packages would be things like you see on the right, which were cribbage boards that had radios in them. They were hidden inside the cribbage board. You can see this by X-ray, what it was like. They also would send baseballs with radios in baseballs. They would send Monopoly boards, and if you took the Monopoly board apart, there would be maps inside and money and so forth. And so they had this whole system of not only communicating, but also sending stuff to prisoners of war that were in Germany. Another very important part of what happened at Fort Hunt. Okay, next. One of the really great stories that came out of Fort Hunt, two fellows who were there after the war, they were still interrogating prisoners. In fact, they established a new type of position at Fort Hunt called the morale officer. Now, these were very young men who were barely out of their teens, if they were out of their teens at all. And their job was to keep these Germans happy, because after the war, they wanted to keep them in the United States to help them. They brought engineers, scientists, and so forth to help in the Cold War. So one of the fellows who was here by the name of Arno Mayer, who's still alive. He was a professor at Princeton, and a buddy of his, Leslie Wilson, what were planning to go to New York. Arno Mayer was from New York. He'd arranged a couple of hot dates for them, and so they were planning to go to New York. And they needed to get to the train station, so they went out on the GW Parkway. It was just called the Parkway, Memorial Parkway, not GW at the time, to hitch a ride. So this car comes along with three women in it, stops. It's pouring rain, picks them up, say, "Where are you going?" "We're going to Union Station." "Well, we can't take you that far, but we can get close." And so a woman sitting in the back seat got into the front seat. So all three women in the front seat, these two men were in the back seat. They get to Union Station, they get on the train, they start talking to each other, and they say, "Do you know what General Eisenhower's wife's name is?" "No." "Well, they kept calling the woman sitting in the middle Mamie, and they kept talking about General Eisenhower. Do you think it was her?" "Well, I don't know." So they get to New York, they start checking and find out, yes, indeed, Mamie is Mrs. Eisenhower. So they decide amongst themselves that it'd be really nice to write a letter to thank her for picking them up. So they do. Well, a week or so later, the commanding officer at Fort Hunt calls them into their office. Now, you can imagine they're absolutely terrified because they think they're probably going to get cashiered out of the Army. They're going to get court-martialed and cashiered out of the Army for hitchhiking, for writing a letter to Mamie Eisenhower. Well, what happens is they walked in the office and the commanding officer started bowing and scraping to them and saying, "You won't believe this." Hands them this letter from General Eisenhower, who at the time was the chief of staff of the Army. And so you can see that you can read the letter here. It says that, Mrs. Eisenhower hasn't been feeling well. She asked me to write a letter to you to thank you for writing a letter to her. We always like to pick people up like you because we always learn something, and we're really glad. Signed, Dwight D. Eisenhower. One of the wonderful things that came out of the interviews, the oral history interviews that we did, is the two men who, one of them kept the letter, the other kept the envelope, and they donated both of those to the park, which you see here. One of the really kind of fun stories that came out of Fort Hunt. Okay, next. Well, the two primary culprits of the Park Service who did the oral history interviews, arranged for the interviews, and then built this monument were Vince Santucci on the left, who was the chief ranger at the time at Fort Hunt, and Brandon Bice on the right side, who really did a lion's share of the oral history interviews, and without them this would have never happened. And it's a wonderful story in and of itself, how they were able to find 65 people who were stationed at Fort Hunt, were able to do oral history interviews. And by the way, if you're interested, Fort Hunt has a site with all of the interviews. Not all, but most of the interviews are there. You can either do a transcript, you can listen to it, or in many cases, you can actually watch a video that they did of these oral history interviews. Well, next slide. The way that I got interested in this, when I became chief historian, the weekend before I literally the weekend before I started as chief historian, there was an article in the Washington Post about a reunion of all the men that were stationed at Fort Hunt who had who the Park Service had interviewed. They paid for them to come into Fort Hunt. The Washington Post did an article on this. I didn't know a thing about it. I had been the superintendent at Manassas Battlefield before I became chief historian. Didn't know a thing about it. I looked at this. I go, wow, this is a really wonderful story. So the first day I was started on the job as chief historian, I called the superintendent, who was a good friend of mine, David Vella. I said, I would really like to meet with your people that are doing this project. And so I went out that week and met with them and started talking to them. They said, well, we've done all the interviews we can do. We don't really have enough money to travel. Well, I actually had some money in my budget. I was new, so I was able to get a little bit of money. And so I was able to help them travel around the country to do the oral history interviews. And I'm glad I did, because some really important stories came out of people who were like in California or different parts of the country. one of the really interesting stories about that was they were getting ready to go to Cleveland, Ohio to interview someone who was there. The family called and said that he had just gone into a coma. And so they canceled their trip. Well, Monday, the man came out of the coma, looked around, he said, "Where's the Park Service?" So they called him and said, "You need to go over here." So they jumped on a plane, went there and interviewed him. And literally, several of the people we interviewed either were in their deathbed or died just a few weeks or months after we interviewed them. So we were very, very fortunate to get the interviews that we had. So next slide. Paul Fairbrook, as I mentioned, has become a very good friend. He was featured a year ago on 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes did a story on Camp Ritchie. He was there. He was one of the people who was interviewed. He came back, and his rabbi actually interviewed him and asked him a bunch of things about being on the 60 Minutes show. I've talked to him a bunch of times. In fact, I actually worked for Viking cruise ships, and I was on a cruise a few months ago, and somehow this phone call came through. I don't know how, because I had my phone on. It shouldn't have come through, but I saw the area code from Stockton, California, where he is from, and I'm terrified that his family's going to tell me that he passed. No, it was actually Paul himself. He said, "Bob, I saw you on television. You need to talk slower. I can't hear it quite. You're talking too fast. You need to slow down so I can hear you better. And I wanted you to use this document I sent you, but you should use it," and blah, 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 went on and on and on. So he's still as sharp as can be. But what I wanted to read you was what he said to his rabbi about how important he thought his role in World War II was. And I think this is absolutely beautiful. He said, "First, I was able to revenge in whatever way I could my loss of my uncle, my aunt, and my cousins, my family, to the Holocaust. I had the chance to really do something about that. Second, and equally important, I had the chance to thank the United States for letting me and my family in. Because of that, I, my children, and my grandchildren are all doing well in this wonderful country." And with that last slide, thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was fascinating. So we actually have a lot of questions that have come in, so we'll see how many we can get to. We had quite a few people ask, was there ever an escape from Fort Hunt?
There was an attempted escape. I'll have to find the name here. Hold on. There was a U-boat pilot, a U-boat captain, and I'll see if I can find his name. Well, unfortunately, I'm just going to tell you, there was a U-boat captain. I don't have his name at the tip of my tongue here, unfortunately. I can look here in a little bit. But he had been very successful sinking a lot of ships. He was convinced that if he was turned over to the British would probably hang him for what he had done. Well, that wasn't going to happen. But he was so afraid of that, he actually ran out to the fence, started scaling the fence, and was shot. And we think it wasn't really that he was trying to escape. It was that he was trying to commit suicide by guard. I'll try to find the name before we're done here. But yeah, that was the only that we know of, the only escape attempt.
Another question here. Did the prisoners know that they were in the United States as opposed to somewhere in Europe?
Yes, they did. In fact, Fort Hunt really was not a prison camp. It was not a POW camp. In fact, it was kind of in a gray area with the Geneva Convention because they really were not considered POWs when they were there. And so generally what would happen, they'd go through two different layers before they came to Fort Hunt. First of all, if they were in the European theater, or even mostly European theater, there would be an initial interrogation there. In fact, most of the men who were trained at Camp Ritchie were actually in Europe. A large percentage were there. And so the initial, in many cases, the initial interrogation would take care of there. Then if they thought they might have something useful to tell the folks at Fort Hunt, they would be sent to a place called a place in Pine Furnace in Pennsylvania, north of Gettysburg. They'd be sent there. They were held there, and again there was another interrogation that took place, and then they'd send groups of people to Fort Hunt because they couldn't really hold a huge number of people. So, for example, if there was a U-boat that had 50 survivors or 40 survivors, they couldn't interrogate all of them at one time, so they'd come there in batches. As soon as the interrogation part was finished, they would send them to a regular POW camp. So in many cases, they'd be there for a few days, a week, very seldom longer than a week. They were there generally for a very, very short time, and then they'd be sent from there to a prison camp. So there's really no question that they knew that they were in the United States because they'd gone through this whole process. Usually they were flown from Europe to the United States. So they knew they were there. They really some actually knew that they were in the Washington, D.C. area because they'd been there. They knew about it. But they knew they were in the United States, but they didn't necessarily know that they were in Virginia near Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Another question here. You mentioned that a lot of the prisoners were U-boat crew members. What other specialties did the prisoners have that were considered high value?
Well, it's interesting. There were some pilots. Most of them were ground soldiers, and most of them were not very. Most of the very high level generals and admirals and so forth were actually interrogated in England. They went to England, and that was sort of their role, was to interrogate the very high level folks. But most of the people that came to Fort Hunt, there would be some corporals, sergeants, a few officers. In some cases, later in the war, there'd be like majors, lieutenant colonels. So during the war, it was mostly lower level. But the reason that they would be sent there was like some reason that they would be important. So, for example, if a soldier had been both on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians and the Western Front, they were very, very interested in finding out more about the Russians. So most of the people who'd been in the Eastern Front stayed there. They didn't come to the Western Front. But if they happened to come to the Western Front, they would want to know as much as they could about the Russians, and so they would be sent to Fort Hunt. There was one fellow who was a guard in one of the concentration camps. Well, they thought he might possibly be a war criminal, and they sent him there. He wasn't, but they learned more about the prison camp. So there were different reasons why they sent people to Fort Hunt. Usually they thought they had some kind of information that might be valuable for the American or Allied war effort.
Okay, so a couple more questions here. To what extent did American intelligence operators who managed these POWs communicate and coordinate their efforts with British counterparts who used similar strategies, with German generals being held in very comfortable conditions?
Well, they really exchanged a lot of information. In fact, the MIRS program, the documents program, actually all the documents first went to London. And if something looked like it could be used immediately, they would send it to the military, and so they would have the first crack at all the documents. And they had a lot more people working in London than they did at Fort Hunt. But the really valuable stuff would go to Fort Hunt. And there were a couple of things that were valuable in the documents. So one thing that they found very, very useful was that each soldier had what's called is the best translation is a passbook, and it was kind of like a passport actually. It would talk about any awards they got, where they were, and so forth. And it was very valuable because they could learn just about everything there was to learn about a particular soldier from his passbook. Another thing that each soldier and sailor, German soldier and sailor, was required to carry was a card that listed brothels where they had been and who they had been with. The Germans actually had official brothels as part of their whole military operation, and this was very useful because let's say a German was married. Well, do you think his wife wanted to know that he went to a brothel? Probably not. Or his mother? Probably not. And so in some cases, they could get these guys feeling so guilty that they would give them information. But in some cases, the Germans might look at it and say, gosh, if they know that, they probably know everything. I might as well just tell them everything I know. So that was another very valuable tool that came in. And these were usually came from London that had been captured. And in some cases, they could use information that they had gathered for interrogations. So one of the generals who later was at Fort Hunt, John Kluge, said to him, we know that you were at Rommel's daughter's wedding. It was a small town in Germany. They had a newspaper showing all the generals that were there. So, well, how do you know that I was there? Well, I know you were there because I saw you talking to General so-and-so. Well, but well, we knew because we were there. We saw it. Well, of course they didn't, but they had a newspaper. And so they were able to use a lot of the documents. And so they shared things very, very, very much between the English, the other allies, and Fort Hunt.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question here because it's one that we've gotten a couple times. So what happened to all of the captured Germans at the end of the war? Were they repatriated? Did they stay in the United States? What happened to them?
Generally, they returned to Germany. In fact, almost all of them returned to Germany, and then some of them came back to the United States later, but they were repatriated to Germany. Now, a couple were allowed to stay in the United States. So what happened was that the Germans, they had forced a lot of the captured, the people that they captured, like from Czechoslovakia and so forth, to fight in the German army. Well, one prisoner came to Fort Hunt. He was Czech, and at the end of the war, the Czech Republic was behind the Iron Curtain. So they let him stay in the United States. They didn't force him to go back to Czechoslovakia, but most of them were repatriated to Germany.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate this.